So now that we've got a pretty good handle on how vulnerabilities exist in our enterprise and our small business networks, we're going to talk about assessing those vulnerabilities from a penetration tester's perspective. And basically the methods in which you choose to enumerate vulnerabilities are going to depend on the experience that you've had in the past and what's been successful for you, as well as the target that you're trying to perform vulnerability assessment against. In other words, you're not looking for database vulnerabilities in a web server, and you're not looking for TCP stack overflows on a web server, for example. So definitely keep in mind that a lot of skill and experience and even common sense comes into play at this point. Most of your vulnerability assessment is going to be done using automated tools, and there aren't really a lot of great options out there for vulnerability assessment today. Nessus is probably the single most common vulnerability assessment tool because it's open source, meaning it's free, and it's a great product and it really works well. Most of the other vulnerability assessment tools you're going to find out there are going to be commercial-based tools that are actually built on the open source Nessus. And there are lots of examples out there. You can probably go out and do a web search for vulnerability assessment tool and find a couple of dozen of them. Bearing in mind, most vulnerability assessment tools outside of Nessus and very few commercial tools are specific to the target. A great example of that is Nikto. Nikto is a great vulnerability assessment tool, but it only works for web servers, and it only works under certain circumstances for web servers. But it's continuously being developed, and maybe at some point will be a all-inclusive web server vulnerability assessment tool. But today, we have to rely on something such as Nessus or one of those commercial tools to perform our vulnerability assessment. There are also a lot of other resources that aren't necessarily tools or necessarily vulnerability assessment programs, such as Oval, which is basically a standardized assessment process. They're going to provide you with a database called a common vulnerability database that will allow you to pump that into either a homegrown tool or another tool, for example, and come up with a standardized methodology for performing vulnerability assessment. So they don't actually offer any tools, but they offer the foundation for a great vulnerability assessment methodology. FRCERT, or French Incident Response Team, is actually a website that keeps track of vulnerabilities and disclosures of vulnerabilities and also houses exploit code for those vulnerabilities. Now, one thing to keep in mind is just recently, apparently, the French authorities decided that that was a bad idea to actually host code on the site. So now they've pulled that off. It's not publicly available, but it is available through a subscription-based pay service. So if you subscribe to the FRCERT list, then you can actually go download exploit code, which, if you're doing vulnerability assessment and hacking for a living, is probably a good resource for you. And also, just general public web postings of exploits. I know I've mentioned a little bit earlier that I have a pretty good ritual of going out to these various sites and downloading new sections of code, and you should do the same thing. And there are always new sites out there, new hacker groups coming up with new codes, and you need to really stay on your toes and be out there looking for these things. So we're going to go ahead and move into an example or a demonstration of the Nessus vulnerability assessment tool. And I've actually gone ahead and taken the liberty of setting up the Nessus server because it is a client-server architecture and logging into that system. So that process is fairly lengthy, so I went ahead and did that for us. But basically, we can enable various plugins. We can check for a web server, Cisco, Debian, denial of service, FTP. All these different checks can be enabled. So I've got all those enabled for me. And once we've got that enabled, we're going to go over to our scan options, and we can choose port ranges. We can add details such as nmap, send scans, the netstat scanner. We can go through an entire list of options that are available to us, choose those, and then move over to our target. I've already got our target typed in, and at this point, we would simply click Start the Scan. And again, because Nessus is so thorough and has literally, in my example, 9,000 plugins, we can actually take quite a bit of time to perform this scan. So I'm actually going to load up a report where I've already gone through this process. And this is what our Nessus report is going to look like. I'm going to select the subnet in which I wanted to scan and the target that I want to look at. And based on the severity of the rating, we can see these little icons off to the side. And there's actually quite a few vulnerabilities associated with this system. And we'll look at the more severe ones just in this example. So apparently, the Pixie environment that's running here is a major security hole. So attack can actually gain root privileges or root shell on this particular host. SNMP has a security hole as well, which is where the community name of the SNMP host can be guessed. And we've actually seen that by enumerating lots of information from that system using the public community string. So if we continue looking forward, we can see there's some name server vulnerabilities apparently associated here, where arbitrary code can be executed on the remote host through the Windows Internet Naming Service. We can continue forward. We see we got MySQL running, MSDTC, the distributed transaction coordinator we talked about earlier. And here's our MS SQL server. The SQL server has a blank password for the SA account, which is the system administrator account. That is a result of poor configuration of the database during the installation process. And this is another one of those things we discussed during database vulnerabilities. We can see here as well there's a security hole for this particular service through SMB. So it looks like a denial of service attack can be performed against the SMB service here. And that's going to continue across the board. We've got a messenger service vulnerability, RPC service vulnerability, looks like a denial of service attack. We're using an older version of PHP, which has a set of known exploits so an attacker can gain remote access. We have the denial of service attack available for port 21 or FTP. And the distributed transaction coordinator has a vulnerability for remote code execution. So they could actually completely control this particular system based on that. So as you can see, on this particular system, there are quite a few vulnerabilities. Most of them are a result of not patching the system or not configuring the system to be security-minded and not allow requests from the network. So definitely keep in mind, Nessus is a great resource. It's a little bit complicated to set up, but we'll go into a lot more detail on Nessus at a later time in a different title.